All right. So today we begin our journey in getting to meet another man. It's on. Another man of God. You're gonna be introduced to Samuel. So let's turn from the outline over to where I have just notes for 1 Samuel. These may seem a little disjointed to you. This is just kind of how I was pulling all my information together. We'll talk about it as we go through and see how far we get in that. So, following the notes, 1 and 2 Samuel were originally one book. In fact, the earliest copies of 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings were put together. The 4 books were put together, and it was called the Book of Kingdoms in the earliest writings. If you can imagine how large a book that would have been, 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. So when it was first separated, it was put into 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 3 Kings, and 4 Kings. Okay? And then in the Septuagint, which is the Greek rendition of the Old Testament, the 1 and 2 Kings becomes 1 and 2 Samuel, and then 3 and 4 Kings becomes 1 and 2 Kings. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's how the name came about. So Samuel is not the author of the book. He dies in chapter 25, so it would be impossible for him to be the author of the complete book, although he likely wrote some of the earliest chapters. The reason it's called Samuel is because he is the key character in the material, not because he is the author of the book. The author is actually unknown. We really don't know. There is supposition that it could have been compiled of Samuel, of Gad. You're going to know these people by the end of the book. Of Nathan, and probably other scribes who would have taken the writings and compiled them all together. But we don't know that for sure. We do know that all of these people that are mentioned here had a part in writing it. They're going to be mentioned as we go through the book, and you're going to see that they have sections, but no one person did that, wrote the entirety of the book. 1 Samuel, and I'm only really giving you information on 1 Samuel. When we do 2 Samuel, we'll get a whole new bunch of information. But 1 Samuel has 31 chapters. I figure that'll take us a little while to get through just that portion of it. The focus of 1 Samuel is, first of all, it's going to be the birth and the ministry of Samuel. So we're going to get to know Samuel from the time he is conceived until the time he dies. And we'll get to know a lot of information about Samuel and his importance in God's plan. It's the focus is also going to be on the rise and the fall of King Saul, the first king of Israel. And then thirdly, it's going to be the transition of rule from Saul to David. And we're going to find out what that's going to look like. The book was written somewhere between the years of 931 BC and 722 BC. There's some information in the book that's going to help us pinpoint that. I'll bring it up when we get to those chapters, and it'll say a certain event that'll give us a time frame, and that's how we know that it was during this time based on the events that are mentioned. Mm-hmm. We know it couldn't have been earlier than that or later than that, and we'll be able to, that's how scholars have determined that it's sometime between 931 and 722. The book covers events that happened within a 110 to 125 year time span. You're going to have to be gracious about when I give you dates on this. Few dates are firm. There's a couple that we know for sure when that happened. But there are a lot of dates that you're going to find a wide variety of scholars have different opinions on, sometimes as much as 20 or 25 years in how they see these things happen. It doesn't really matter for our study exactly the year. It's always fun to kind of know so that we can pinpoint it. But understand up front that any dates that I give you, if you want to, and you go home and you pull up enough commentaries, you're going to find people that disagree with that 10, 15, 20 years in varying directions. It isn't it isn't a huge thing. During this time period, there was no great power that was trying to take over Israel. The Hittites were gone. Egypt's power had been significantly weakened by now. The Edomites and the Moabites were mostly peaceful at this time. However, the Philistines continue to be a thorn in the side of Israel. Some background information. The Philistines come from the Aegean Islands, Greece, Crete. They come primarily from that area. And they came over into, that's why they come off of the Mediterranean Sea and they gather in that area right there by the sea. They were around as early as the time of the patriarchs. They were a considerable foe, even early on, because of their unique ability to work with iron. They were iron smelters, and they were, at that time, the only people who had the knowledge of knowing how to work with iron. So how would that help? Weaponry. How they would be able to make weaponry would be a great deal more beneficial than anything that you could come up with wood or stone or any other way that it was being used. So they became a considerable foe primarily because of the fact that they were able to make very dangerous killing machines to go out and attack their enemies. So we're going to talk a little bit about Samson, not to be confused with Samuel. Samson, who was a judge for the years between 1069 and 1049. He often fought with the Philistines and helped to keep the damage they created in check. So you would have to go to the book of Judges and read the whole story of Samson. You know Samson. Samson is the one, Samson who always goes with a Delilah. Mm-hmm. And he's the one who grew his hair long and his strength was in his hair. He's the one who was blinded at the end of his life. And his last act on earth was pushing the pillars out of the Philistine temple and killing a huge number of the Philistines along with himself at that time. Samson was one of the last of the judges. There are a few more after him, but one of the at the end period of time at the judges. Let's talk a minute about the judges. If in between the time of there was Moses, and then when Moses died, he gave his authority to lead to Joshua. And then when Joshua dies, there's a gap of time for the children of Israel. And this is the time of the judges. I think, let me check real quick. I think I gave you a list of, yeah, I did. Ancient Jewish history, the judges of ancient Israel, right here on your book. So I gave you a listing just for your background information. We won't study this really, but these are the judges that were in the time period of the judges. These are human beings that God selected to rule and reign. And at the end of each one of their stories, you will hear the same statement in the book of Judges, and it says, "And every man did whatever was right in his own eyes." So you can only imagine by that statement, it's mentioned over and over and over, and you can imagine by that statement how chaotic a time that was. It was a time where there wasn't a lot of rule of law, where man went out and created his own revenge, his own justice, his own way of dealing with things. But the judges were there to sort of oversee that and to do the best that they could. It just unfortunately didn't seem to work all that well, and many of the judges didn't behave in godly manners, much like the kings of Israel later on, you know, that God puts into power. And so if they don't follow God's teaching in these areas, you can see how it becomes chaotic. So Samson, you can tell by the chart, is down towards the last three parts of the judges, and he and Samson and Samuel have an overlapping ministry. So Samson is at the end of his ministry as Samuel is beginning a ministry time. In most cases, either that or Samson has just ended it when Samuel comes on. But they may have had an overlapping ministry at the end of Samson's lifetime. First Samuel is going to begin. We're going to start the whole book study out with being introduced to the judge, who was also the high priest, and his name was Eli, or Eli, as That's how Arnold calls him, Eli. He, which I guess is right, because he's a Jewish man and speaks Hebrew. That must be the correct pronunciation. We call him Eli. He lived 1165 to 1067. He died when he's 98 years old. He was the second to the last judge of Israel between 1107 and 1167. He judged for 40 years. I found it fascinating when I was doing some background study at how oftentimes that 40 years is a time frame that God allows there to be judgment or reign. 40 years, over and over and over, you're going to see that. He reigned for 40 years. He ruled for 40 years. It's a time frame that God uses very often. Samuel is born around 1100 BC, and he's going to live between the years of 1100 BC and 1014, approximately 90 years old when he dies. His name, Shemuel, if you were going to say it in the Hebrew, Shemuel, means name of God or God has heard. And we're going to see that that fits him beautifully when we read the first chapter. He ministered to Israel between the years of approximately 1105 and 1013. He lived between the years of 1102 and 1014, approximately 90 years. This is not information we're going to spend a lot of time on, but it's good to have for our background information. And if you have a question about something, so you can come back and check with this. He was made a judge in approximately 1094, and he was called to ministry at a very early age. Perhaps around, it seems to be reasonable to assume around 8 to 10 years old that he's called to ministry. Now, there are going to be people that say that it was a little later than that, and there are even a few that say it was a little earlier than that. But it seems to be reasonable to assume that it was a very early age. He's called a child. So 8 to 10 years, he's called in to begin his ministry. We're going to find that he was a priest, he was a judge, and he was a prophet. So he fulfills all three of those offices in varying ways throughout the book.
Kathy, who sets in place a judge? You know what I mean?
They were selected by God to put into place which judges came into rule. Notice too that there's a woman in there. I just thought that was Deborah is in there too. So that's an interesting thing to notice. So Samuel was approximately 79 when he anoints David as a king. David is probably around 15. David is going to kill Goliath. I'm kind of getting into some of David a little bit early, but it is interesting information. He's going to kill Goliath when he's a teenager, but he's going to have to wait 15 years after he's anointed to become the king of Israel. David reigns for 40 years, 7 years from the city of Hebron and 33 from Jerusalem, and he dies when he's 70 years old. Again, we're kind of jumping around, but just information for you to have. By the time of the birth of Samuel, by the time that he's born, the priesthood has become very corrupt. You see that over and over in Israel's history. We also know that by the time Jesus comes, once again, the priesthood, very corrupt. You're going to see that Eli, who was the high priest, prophet, and judge of the day, has a couple of adult sons that are going to be punished for their very ungodly behavior. I'll leave that until we get there. Later on, Samuel has some adult sons of his own who would have gone on to become judges and rulers of Israel, except for they also have their own issues. And their ungodly behavior is the reason why the people say, we don't want judges anymore. Give us a king. And so we see the ungodly behavior of Eli and of Samuel have a great impact in Israel's desire to have a king.
And excuse me, the people started having judges because they asked God for judges, didn't they, in the beginning? And then that didn't work out so well, so then they...
Well, I don't know that they ask for judges, but they do ask for kings. God appoints judges, but we're going to find out that asking for something, be careful what you ask for, because you just might get it. And that's not always a real good thing. Not only had the priesthood become really corrupt, but the spiritual condition in the land of Israel was very poor, and they desperately needed to be pointed towards God. They had fallen into idolatry. They had They had accepted the ways of the nations around them, their idols, and the things that they worshipped. They took that on into their own culture. There was a huge percentage of the people who no longer followed the rule and reign that, or the laws that God had set down. But as we always see over and over and over again, there was still a godly remnant of people who remained faithful to the Lord. Samuel's parents are examples of those faithful people. We're going to see Samson's parents were examples of those faithful people. Timeline on this comes at the tail end of the story of Ruth and Boaz. So there's some more godly people that are still involved in it. So we do know that there were godly people still, that remnant, that core remnant that God never allows to completely disappear and for everyone to fall into idolatry or any of those other things. But at this point in time, it was definitely a remnant because the majority of people had fallen away. All right, some interesting facts about Samuel. He's the one who founds the lineage of prophets. He starts it. We read about that in Acts and in Hebrews. You can go home and read it. He's the beginning of the line of prophets. We're going to meet Gad and Nathan, both of whom helped gather information and perhaps wrote parts of this book. They're going to be interesting and important parts of this. Outside of the book of Samuel, Samuel is mentioned 5 times in the Old Testament and 3 times in the New Testament. He's referenced in 2 other New Testament places where he's not called by name, but he's used as a reference. 1 Samuel is the first mention of the term Lord of Hosts. So that would be Jehovah Sabaoth. 1 Samuel is the first place we see the term anointed used. Remember, anointed means Messiah. Not just the Messiah with a capital M, but Messiah, the anointed one of God. And we see that used here. 1 Samuel is the only place where you see the name Ichabod, which means his glory has left. And so you're gonna be introduced to that. And then there's also the name Ebenezer, which comes from, every time that the song comes on, "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing," you know, someone who has a better voice than me can hum the tune. And it says, "Here I raise my Ebenezer," and I wonder how many people out here really know what that is when they sing that song, because it means stone of help. It means a stone of help. And we're going to see how God uses that to memorialize something wonderful that he does for the children of Israel. And it's called an Ebenezer, a stone of help. So next time that song comes on, you'll know what it's talking about. Stone of help.
I've never heard either.
Come thou fount of every blessing. Yep. Dun, dun, dun. That's right. Oh, and now we're on YouTube singing. That's great. All right. So the differences between a prophet and a priest. A prophet speaks to the people for God, and a priest speaks to God for the people. So in case you are wondering the differences, there you go. An outline of 1 Samuel. I gave you a detailed outline on your first page. You can look at that at your leisure this week. But just quickly, chapters 1 through 3, we're going to see the birth and the dedication of Samuel up until he's about 12 years old. Chapters 4 and 6, we're going to do some reading about the Ark of the Covenant. It's going to be captured. We're not going to read a lot about Samuel during that time frame. They're silent years of Samuel's life. And the next time we see him after 12, he'll be in his early 30s. Because ages 30 through 50 is a very important time in the years of the ages of a priest. You needed to be, some say 25, 30, but at 30 through 50 are the ages where the priests worked. After 50, they retired from that. So back to chapter 7 and 8, Samuel is going to be made a judge. Chapters 8 through 15, Saul is made the king. Chapters 16 through 31 is the biggest portion of the book. That's the transition from Saul to David, and we are going to be inundated with amazing stories. of how God makes that transition, how both men fight for it, fight against it, fight for it, and the amazing things that God allows them to do, how he intercedes on behalf of his chosen. Just a lot of really great stories. We're going to see the error of Saul's ways in chapters 13 through 15. You're going to see his impatience brought out, his foolish promises, and finally we'll see Saul and his rebellion. So we'll get to see that. The key chapter, those of you who are good at inductive, you may come up with something different. I think it's 16, and that's the transition from Saul to David. Key verses. Chapter 13, verse 14, it says, "But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be commander over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And that's spoken to Saul. The theme is to establish the throne of David. Why is that important? Because that is to be an everlasting covenant promise, that the throne of David would never cease, and that through the throne of David, the Messiah would come. So it's hugely important that David come onto the historical line and start, and God initiates his throne. We're also, a secondary theme is going to be the events of the Ark of the Covenant, because it plays an important part in Samuel. The purpose for the book of Samuel. There's a couple of different purposes. One's in a historical book. Both books of Samuel explain how Israel got a king. We're going to find out that it's man's choice versus God's choice. You can only imagine how that's going to turn out. The second thing that the purpose is going to show us is it's going to vindicate David. It needs to show that David did not usurp the throne from Saul. He didn't go in and take it by force. He was anointed and he was placed in that position by God. That's very important for historical purposes as that lineage continues on. And it's to show that David is the godly line from which the Messiah is going to come. So it sets a precedent that's hugely important. Theological purposes, it's the history of the Davidic covenant. It's important for all those reasons that I just told you about. It's to show God's providence in the lives of his people. Of course, you see that in every book of the Bible. That's the same story over and over again. But we're going to see that, how God is going to work in minute details, again, in everyday ways, in leadership, in government, in the lives of people, in marriages, in all kinds of ways. God is providential in the lives of his people. People may choose kings, but God creates dynasties. And that's the important part of this. Okay, it's a book of transition. It's the transition from the time of the judges to the time of the kings. Somebody said it was a bending of the history of Israel and a hinge as everything begins to change. For the first time, we're going to see kings come to Israel. Now, timeline of this is that we have been studying Ezekiel, and Ezekiel is the end of that lineage of the kings. We saw in Ezekiel the temple of Solomon was destroyed, finished, and the last king of Israel was Zedekiah, and we talked about him a lot in our Ezekiel. So now you've got to back up, because now we're at the beginning of the kings. We also don't have a temple yet. The temple of Solomon has not yet, as we begin 1 Samuel, the temple has not been built. They are still working under the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle. There is no temple built. So you can see we're backpedaling a little bit from where we were with Ezekiel to the beginning of that. So it's a transition from the judges to the time of the kings. Israel is going to go from being a group of tribes who sort of self-ruled, each tribe making its own rules, following in the way that their leaders chose them to being a nation united under God. The kingdom has not split. as we start Samuel, the kingdom has not split. Remember, we talked about the northern kingdom a lot, the 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom, the 2 tribes, and how they had different leaders, different kings. It was completely separated. But that hasn't happened. This is, again, we're backpedaling because Israel is now coming together as a nation for the first time. It becomes a theocratic nation, which just means it's a government that's ruled by priests of God. They're going to have a huge part in how the people live their lives. It's a form of leadership. It actually begins with Moses at Mount Sinai, and it's going to end with the last king of Judah, Zedekiah. So the sequence of leadership would be Moses, Joshua, the judges, and then the kings. We will discover and discuss why it was wrong for the people to demand a king. Why God gave them a king that they desired. Who was the one that God had chosen, and why timing is so important. We will see that many of the Psalms were written by David to memorialize events that happened in the book of Samuel. We're going to attempt to tie the appropriate Psalms to the events when they come up in our study. So I'm going to try and show you when an event happens in our study that if you go back to Psalms, you'll see that David wrote, because David wrote the majority of the Psalms, and he writes them about events that we're going to be studying. So we'll get to go back and look at the Psalm that attaches to that particular chapter, and you'll see him writing about it. We'll also use many of the corresponding scriptures from the book of Kings and of Chronicles, and I enclosed a harmony chart for you that we'll use many times. You'll get used to this. Didn't I? Did I say I did and then I didn't? I'm sorry. I'll have it for you. I'll have it for you the next time. I didn't enclose it. It's just going to show you where when we go into the book of Samuel, where there is going to be scripture in Chronicles or Kings that you can take home with you and look at that week. It'll just give you more details. I'll have that for you next week. And so, theology. We're going to discuss the Davidic covenant, the dynasty, the kingdom, the throne, the descendants. We're going to spend a lot of time on the Davidic covenant. Christology. We're going to study how Messiah is the eternal son of David and how that all came about and was set into motion. The providence of God. God controls the government of men and their leaders. We saw that in Daniel, didn't we? A lot. And so now we're going to get to see that here. We're going to get to read about the temporary indwelling or overwhelming of the Holy Spirit versus the internal indwelling of the Holy Spirit. It's kind of a new thing that we're going to get to study about. And we're going to see examples of the eternal continuation of the soul after death. This is going to be important. We'll see the rejection of Samuel was actually the rejection of God. And we'll see that the acceptance of Saul was actually the acceptance of the rule of man. We're going to see the contrast between David, the choice of God, and Saul, the choice of man. So there will be a lot of lessons there. All right, so then you have the judges. I gave you a sheet on Saul, Samuel, and David and their hometowns. With a little bit of information on Ramah underneath it. Ramah is where Samuel is going to come from. You're going to see that name pop up a lot because it's going to come up. So I want you to at least be familiar with these towns. They're important, where Saul comes from, where David's hometown is, why these are important. Then if you turn the page, you'll see the kingdom of Saul on a map of Israel. So what you might want to do is be familiar with these towns that I give you on this page. Find them on here so that you can see in Israel where they are. You might even want to circle them. I want you to just get familiar with the land of Israel during this time and where these towns that we're going to be talking about, how far they are from each other, where they are at, that sort of information. The next one is a location of Samuel's ministry. These are the names that you're going to see as Samuel goes from town to town, place to place, where he's going to be doing God's work. And you can see it's within a relatively small section. So, but a lot of work is being done there, so you can get familiar with the map. And that will probably get us started on that. Good. We are going to have time to do chapter 1. That's perfect. So just take a packet, and we will get started with chapter 1 today. We'll be able to finish it in a half an hour.
That's exciting. I think Jolley
Kathy, this need to be turned on.
Yes, because we're going to do a reading. So we'll turn it off until we get ready to do the teaching on chapter 1.